Hi everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is McKenna and I am a winter naturalist at Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. Thank you for coming tonight. Each winter, ACES partners with Wilderness Workshop and the Roaring Fork Audubon to co-host Naturalist Nights, a free winter speaker series featuring experts from around the country who explore different topics of the natural world within our community. We would like to thank our generous sponsors. These businesses provide financial and in-kind donations that make Naturalist Nights possible, including the cookies and tea you're enjoying tonight. A special thank you to tonight's featured silver sponsors, Ute Mountaineer and Strafe. We are recording tonight's presentation. A cleaned up recording will be made available on ACES and Wilderness Workshop's YouTube channel in the coming days. We hope you will join us Tuesday, February 24th at the Wheeler Opera House for a lecture from our Changemaker series, Defying Limits with Gerlinda Kaltenbrunner, and for our final Naturalist Night talk on March 4th, Douglas Fir Beetle in the Roaring Fork Watershed with Colorado State entomologist Dr. Dan West. The topic tonight is one that has a lot of personal significance in my life. It was through birding and avian research that I first entered into the field of ecology. I've worked on a variety of avian research projects, both in the field and in the lab, and it's through birding that I find myself connecting strongly with the world around me. Birds are all around us and play a key role in the ecosystems that they inhabit. Brett Walker has been a researcher in the Avian Research section with Colorado Parks and Wildlife out of Grand Junction since 2007. His research interests include conservation, management, behavioral ecology, and population monitoring of upland gamebirds and songbirds, with a focus on sagebrush-steppe ecosystems and issues related to the energy development. His work for Colorado Parks and Wildlife on Greater Sage-Grouse includes high-resolution habitat mapping and prioritization, habitat use and selection in oil and gas fields, evaluating the effectiveness of different habitat treatments as proposed mitigation, and testing the reliability of current lek-based monitoring and management strategies. In his free time, he can be found fly fishing, mountain biking, fly tying, birding, big game hunting, and volunteering for Grand Valley Audubon and Grand Valley anglers. Please silence all devices and remember to hold your questions until the end of the presentation. We will have a brief Q&A session. With that, I'm excited to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Dr. Brett Walker.
All right. Great. Thank you, McKenna. So again, my name is Brett Walker, Avian Research Section with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I really appreciate you guys having me up because it's nice to get out of the desert. And in my work, I'm getting to get out of the sage-grouse vortex. So if you were hoping to hear about sage-grouse, unfortunately, that won't be tonight. I'm going to talk about a different species. But I'd be happy to come back if you'll have me to do talk on all the work we've been doing on sage-grouse over the past 17 or 18 years as well. So in my almost 20-year career with CPW, most of my time has been spent with this species, the Greater Sage-Grouse. But tonight I'm going to talk about some of my more recent research on a different species, a migratory songbird known as the Brewer sparrow. Before I started with CPW, I spent several years studying Brewer sparrows. I started working on them in Eastern Washington in 1996, and that was the year that I fell in love with sagebrush ecosystems and sagebrush birds. It's how I eventually ended up in the sage-grouse world, but this is the bird that really got me started. So a year later, I came back and I studied their singing behavior for my master's degree. And then I took a year and studied their whole summer and studied shared incubation duties between males and females. Unlike most migratory songbirds, the males actually incubate and they're really good dads. So this bird is near and dear to my heart. So I appreciate the chance to talk about it. I started with CPW in 2007, but in 2021, I finally had an opportunity to solve a long-standing mystery in Colorado ornithology related to Brewer sparrows. It's something I had been wondering about for over 25 years. I'll tell you a little bit more about how I got there. So tonight, again, getting out of the sage-grouse vortex and into the world of Brewer sparrows. I'll tell you about a project we did where we combined data from ongoing national and regional bird monitoring programs, as well as information from citizen scientists, so e-birders basically, as well as field and lab research to solve the mystery of Colorado's alpine Brewer sparrows. I'm going to start with the acknowledgments. This project was funded by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. We appreciate the assistance from numerous individuals, organizations, and agencies. In particular, Tony Luckering. If you may know him, he's big in the birding world. He used to be with Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory before they became Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And he was the one who planted this idea in my head when I was doing my master's work in 1997. As I also want to recognize the Integrated Monitoring of Bird Conservation Program. So that's Bird Conservation Regions Program, IMBCR, with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. This is a crucial monitoring resource for Colorado and surrounding states. Also eBird, Boulder County Nature Association, especially Dave Hollick, he's also what I call an Artemisia-phile. He loves his sagebrush birds. And also the public sound repositories, the Macaulay Library at Cornell, Xenocanto, and the Brewer Library of Bioacoustics at Ohio State. There may actually be some names you recognize in the birders list here who have contributed to this work. So birders have been really important in all the work that I've done on this species. Backing up just a step, a fundamental part of assessing the conservation status of wildlife populations is knowing which species and subspecies we have in the state and where they occur. And for several species in Colorado, we're actually making new discoveries. Things like pygmy rabbit, different strains of cutthroat trout, northern flying squirrels, just recently documented north of Grand Junction for the first time. A whole new population of Baird sparrows that we did not know about before on the Front Range near Boulder. So there are a suite of avian habitat specialists in Western North America that are normally considered sagebrush-obligates during the breeding season. So in Colorado, this includes greater and Gunnison sage-grouse, sagebrush sparrow, sage thrasher, and the sagebrush subspecies of the Brewer sparrow. This is one we'll focus on. So this subspecies, the scientific name is Spizella breweri. It breeds in sagebrush ecosystems across the western U.S. and southern Canada, but more or less south of the black dashed line on this range map. So this is their breeding range, kind of in orange, and they winter in southwestern U.S. and northern Mexico. There's a year-round range here, and then these are areas that they migrate through. So south of this black dashed line is where the sagebrush Brewer sparrows occur. It's one of our smallest sparrows. I call it's the ultimate LBJ. I mean, if you want an LBJ, this is it. I think in the original Birds of North America account, Leon Dawson from 1922 said, here we have a bird with no marks of distinction whatsoever. I think that might be I think that should have been used for the warbling vireo myself, but there's a couple of streaks and something on this bird. So it's not much to look at. I'll give you that. I mean, when you can actually find them. But at least they are interesting birds. And when it sings, that's when this species really makes an impression. Andrew Spencer, who runs earbirding.com website, he's really eloquent. He said, there are few experiences in the West as sublime as being out in the crisp, cool air, surrounded by the smell of sagebrush, and hearing the tinkling buzzes of brewer sparrow all around you. Now, males have repertoires of over 50 song types. Each individual will sing more than 50 different songs. But what most people don't know is that they have two different categories of songs. These are short songs and long songs. Short songs are given almost exclusively by unpaired males that have not found a mate yet. So right when they arrive, boy, they're really singing those short songs. And they sing them in what's called repeat mode. So the same song over and over. Let's just do a quick listen here. This is kind of a classic two-part Brewer sparrow short song. This is the short song. 1, 2, 5, 6. They sing at about a rate of 10 songs per minute, so every 6 seconds. And the interesting part is these males are, well, I'll get to that in just a second. In contrast, the songs that they're kind of more famous for, their long songs, can be as much as 35 or 40 seconds long. These are the songs that they give during the dawn chorus, almost in the dark, as the sun's starting to come up. And they give them also in really aggressive interactions with other males on the edges of their territories. High-pitched trills. There we go. And that's a fairly short version of a long song. They can go for forever. Anyway, that's one of the more spectacular songs in North America, I would argue. So what's odd though is that Brewer sparrows have also been reported numerous times in shrubs from alpine areas above tree line in summer across the western U.S. states. In particular, Colorado has had quite a few records in alpine areas over the years. So this is a photo by Bill Schmoker, who's a Front Range birder, from a 2008 article in Birding Magazine by Tony Luckering that discussed this phenomenon. So, and some of the locations where they had been found before include the Flat Tops Wilderness, Guanella Pass, Rollins Pass near Winter Park, and lots of records from Rocky Mountain National Park up on Medicine Bow Curve, right at the very top. But what those birds are has been a mystery. These alpine birds in Colorado. And that's because there's a whole separate subspecies of the brewer sparrow called the timberline sparrow. And this is Spizella breweri taverneri. This subspecies is known to nest in alpine shrubs at tree line, but its known breeding range is strictly north of that dashed line. So we're talking about the Canadian Rockies and recently discovered in southeastern Alaska, all the way down into northwestern Montana in Glacier National Park and Lewis and Clark National Forest nearby. Just a little side note, nobody had actually confirmed nesting timberline sparrows in the lower 48 states until 1997. That was when I was working on brewer sparrows for my master's. I wrapped up most of my field work in June. And Steve Nyadek, who was a Park Service biologist in Glacier, he called me up and says, do you want to come up here and survey for timberline sparrows? I think we have them in the park. There was only 5 or 6 records, mostly from him. And that's because, let's be honest, not a lot of people go to Glacier National Park and wander around before dawn, off trail, by themselves in grizzly country, really, So anyway, it was a little bit of a harrowing 2 summers that I spent, 2 Julys that I spent up there. But we actually documented 27 different breeding locations of timberline sparrows in the park. And that's when it really sank in. There's so little that we know about birds in our high elevation mountains, even to this day. So there's also some unresolved, I'm going to geek out here, science geek. There's unresolved taxonomic debate about whether the timberline sparrow should be considered a full separate species from the sagebrush bird. And that's because they have pronounced differences in vocalizations, breeding habitat, and timing of breeding. And all 3 of those things can contribute to what's known as reproductive isolation, meaning if you have a group with these 3 different things, they can not interbreed. That prevents them from interbreeding with the other subspecies. They're also slightly larger and grayer. So what are Colorado's alpine brewer sparrows is a question we were asking. Of course, the first possibility is that they could be previously undocumented breeding populations of timberline sparrows. Another possibility is maybe they're just sagebrush sparrows breeding in kind of atypical shrub habitat. Something that, that subspecies is known to do on occasion. It'll breed in snowberry or ceanothus or mountain mahogany. There's a couple of other less likely possibilities. Maybe this is a hybrid zone between the two subspecies that we didn't know about before. Maybe alpine birds in Colorado are a third subspecies. Of course, we need some genetic data probably to figure that out because they're already so similar. Or maybe we're getting all excited for nothing and they're actually just non-breeding birds. You know, they breed down low and maybe they just move up into the alpine like several other species do in the summertime. This has been an unresolved issue since the mid-1990s. Ron Lambeth, who's a local birder in the Grand Valley, he's always reporting great stuff. He actually wrote the original Brewer sparrow account in the first Colorado Breeding Bird Atlas. Conceivably, these Colorado high country birds could more closely resemble the timberline sparrow in vocalizations, ecology, and morphology, and thereby belong to this potential species. In The Birds of Western Colorado Plateau and Mesa Country by Andrew Ryder and his co-authors, it remains unclear whether these alpine breeders represent a high elevation component of the local population or a southern population of the timberline sparrow. In Tony Lickering's birding article, he said confirmation would require more dedicated efforts, particularly recordings of songs and careful measuring of captured individuals. And again, Andrew Spencer from earbirding.com, it remains one of those exciting areas that needs to be looked at and looked into, a place where anyone with a recorder willing to make the effort to be standing on a high mountain hillside waiting for the dawn can help unravel a mystery. I've never met Andrew, but I love how he writes. So the goal of our project, we wanted to determine the taxonomic affinity of these birds, their breeding status, their habitat use, and then their summer distribution of alpine birds in Colorado. So we started out, obviously we wanted to compile all the historical records from various sources. We then summarized those records in relation to elevation and land cover to identify potential alpine breeding sites. All those data came from the IMBCR program at Bird Conservancy the Rockies, again, eBird, Boulder County Nature Association. They kind of run a local monitoring program in Boulder County. Forest Service biologists like Kim Potter, who you may know, lots of birders. And this is back in the day when we used to do trip reports instead of eBird checklists, or you go back through the old list servers looking for mentions of brewer sparrows. As well as some specimen records from the early 1900s. So all told, we found 186 reports of brewer sparrows at 59 different alpine sites spread across Colorado. And these are sites from 10,800 to 14,000 feet. And more importantly, there's no sagebrush anywhere nearby. And the only indication we had that there was breeding was one record of fledglings in the first week of August by Hugh Kingery himself. Now, Hugh, of course, was the editor of the first Colorado Breeding Bird Atlas. So the next step was, of course, to go out and find these birds. But we also needed birds from nearby sagebrush to compare them to. And because those birds breed earlier, we actually had to go find sagebrush birds first. So we surveyed for and sampled sagebrush birds at 26 different sites across the state in May and early June. And then with help from volunteers and birders, we visited a total of 39 alpine sites. And I say we, that includes a whole bunch of people who contributed. And those sites we visited in June and July, including several locations where they'd been reported before, but also sites that we thought where the vegetation and the elevation looked just right for where we should have some brewer sparrows. So we did that over 3 years, 2021 through 2023. Just for fun, we also surveyed 5 subalpine sites where they occurred. So this is our field survey. This is just the survey sites that we went out to. Obviously, there was a lot of driving in 2021. We were blasting around. It was kind of like a shotgun survey. We'd go survey, hike in to some mountain pass, go survey that one, come back out, drive to our next site, camp out, and then hike up in the dark again to another site. Probably the best shape I've been in a long time. At each site, we documented how many adults we found, mostly singing males, and we look for evidence of breeding, just like you do when you look at the eBird breeding status codes if you're submitting a checklist. At a subset of sites, then we recorded male songs, we collected habitat data, and then we captured males in mist nets to take measurements, photos, as well as blood and feather samples for genetic work. So what did we find? Over 3 summers, we documented a total of exactly 100 adults, and these are mostly territorial singing males, at 26 different alpine sites. We actually found them in almost every mountain range we visited in Colorado. One of the fun things for me was John Tulin, who used to be a biologist for CPW. I was looking at a map in the San Juans, in the very far southern San Juans, and I said to myself, boy, that looks really good for Brewer sparrows. He was volunteering that summer. I said, hey, John, any chance you could drive all the way down there past Durango and go look at that site? Boom, he found Brewer sparrows all the way up at elevation, the southwesternmost point on our map there in the pink. So I also wanted to point out 2 of the local sites that we visited in particular. Now, of course, the first is Independence Pass. Most of you have actually probably been there, maybe multiple times. I had never been to Independence Pass until I was coming back from Twin Lakes on Labor Day in 2019. We drove over the pass, and based on my experience working with timberlines in Glacier, I looked around and I said, this looks fantastic for timberline sparrow habitat. I got to come back here. They'd never been reported at that site, at least not in eBird or any of the records that we knew about. And that's kind of despite being one of the most heavily visited mountain passes. Granted, not everyone goes wandering off into the tundra. And there were no records of Brewer sparrows, but in one morning I went up there, and the first time I found 5 singing males. And I know Brian Giesel has gone up since then and found a lot more birds. As well as, I think Rebecca Weiss, also from your group, she also went up there and found birds in new areas that we didn't know about. The second is Taylor Pass, and that's right on the divide between Express Creek and Taylor River drainages at the top end of the Roaring Fork Valley here. So kind of south and a little bit west, I think, of where we are here in Aspen. Again, I had no idea, but I went up there early in the morning and we found 7 singing males. So are they breeding in alpine areas? We confirmed breeding at 3 different alpine sites. So we were doing a shotgun survey, so we didn't have time to actually spend hours and hours at each site or days and days. But we confirmed breeding at 3 sites, and we considered it probable at 12 other sites based on those eBird breeding status criteria. And this is actually the very first confirmed alpine Brewer sparrow nest in Colorado at Guanella Pass. Of course, Guanella Pass, when you talk to birders, they're like, oh, did you go look for ptarmigan? No, I'm out here looking for Brewer sparrows, and it was really cool because we drove right up to the parking lot. I got out in the pre-dawn light, and there's a male singing right there at the parking lot. So what about timing of breeding? So based on kind of combined evidence from our surveys as well as our breeding status data, and finding nests, alpine males in Colorado start arriving about the 2nd week of June, and females nest through late July. So although the duration of their breeding season is about the same as sagebrush birds, it shifted about 5 to 7 weeks later than our lower elevation sagebrush birds. So, and those dates, more importantly, they closely match reported dates for timberline sparrows much further north. What about habitat? So we found alpine birds in these large willow patches, 3 to 6 feet tall, surrounded by tundra, often with sparse crumholts mixed in. For the plant people, they're Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir crumholts, about anywhere from 4 to 16 feet tall. This is a photo from just east of the Devil's Causeway in the Flat Tops Wilderness. These willow patches are primarily found on ridges and slopes with drier soils rather than the kind of the willow bogs that you find in drainages. That's the willow bogs and drainages, that's where all the Lincoln sparrows are. And these birds are much further up the slope in much drier conditions, as Brewer sparrows are wont to do. And this is a photo from Jarosa Mesa, which is south of Lake City, in the San Juans, looking south toward Creed and the upper Rio Grande River. It's kind of neat, this photo. I actually went back, and this is Bristol Head, which is right above Creed. And I found birds there, and they've also been reported in the Mount Baldy area, south of the Rio Grande River, both of which you can see in this photo. And this perfectly matches timberline sparrow habitat described from Alaska, Canada, and then from Glacier National Park. So they use a variety of low-growing shrub species, but mostly willow and dwarf birch mixed with that krummholz. So again, our habitat structure really closely matches that for timberline sparrows. Moving on to song, we analyzed just the short songs of unpaired males. They're a lot easier to analyze than a 30-second long song, but they're also more important for reproductive isolation because those are the songs that the males are using to attract the females. So it's important if females are coming in and the males are singing the wrong song, they're not going to be attracted to them. That could be really important in terms of their evolution, and splitting into two separate subspecies. So this is a sound spectrograph with frequency on the vertical axis. That's in kilohertz or thousands of cycles per second. Higher, high frequency stuff at the top. This is seconds. So this is about just over a 2-second short song. And the little blue boxes is just an example of all the different acoustic features that we measured on these songs. We looked at 143 males in sagebrush and 52 in alpine areas. So, but what's the difference between sagebrush and timberlines? What would, if these were timberlines, what would we expect to find? Sagebrush birds kind of sound harsher and buzzier, and that's because they have a higher maximum frequency and a wider bandwidth. I'll show you an example of that. Let me first play you that sagebrush bird song, and I believe this is the sound spectrograph for this song. Very rough and buzzy sounding. And this is a male timberline sparrow that I recorded in Glacier. I call him the do-re-mi bird. So it's much clearer, it's more bell-like, or it's been described as kind of tinkling or even insect-like. And the reason is because it has, let's see, gotta click there. So the sagebrush birds have a higher maximum frequency, a slightly lower minimum frequency, and most importantly, that results in a much wider bandwidth of sounds. So in terms of our results, birds in alpine areas, they averaged a narrower bandwidth and a higher minimum frequency than sagebrush birds, but the effect wasn't very strong. And then when we looked at the features that are supposed to differ between timberlines and sagebrush birds, we actually found that there was no statistical difference in things like song maximum frequency here. So this is just to geek out on science here. These are the frequency here, cycles per second. Alpine birds are always in pink. Sagebrush birds are always going to be in orange. These are what we call box and whisker plots, just showing the distribution of the values for each of the habitat type, birds in each of the habitat types. So variables reported to differ between these two subspecies. They weren't different for sagebrush and alpine birds in Colorado. If you get into your multivariate statistics and you do a principal component analysis, all that is a way of taking a whole bunch of different variables and looking at them simultaneously. I won't go into any of the details on that, but you can compare groups based on all of the different acoustic variables that we measured. So our alpine birds are this pink right in the middle, and they overlap with sagebrush birds in this larger orange polygon. And then these are sagebrush Brewer sparrows that we measured from all the recordings in public repositories. And they're really overlap with sagebrush birds. Every bird in Colorado overlaps with this polygon with sagebrush birds. Timberline sparrows are way off to the side, so they're quite different. When we look at external morphology, males had a 5% longer bill. That's not a big difference, but there was no other differences in any of the measurements we looked at. And most importantly, none of the important measurements like wing, mass, and tail that are dramatically different in timberline sparrows. So we didn't find any differences between sagebrush and alpine birds, again, using that principal component analysis. We also looked at color, and color is really neat. You can actually, we analyze the differences in plumage color as well as the bill color. You can use it do that with calibrated, linear, normalized digital images in raw format. So for all the photographers out there, and Chris, you probably know what I'm talking about with raw format here. If you calibrate the image that you take against a known color standard like this, you can actually measure what the red, green, and blue reflectance values are of the bird's plumage without having to, shoot the bird old school ornithology style and, compare them in a collection. So alpine males had slightly darker features overall, which is what we would expect if they were timberline sparrows. But the means only differed for 4 out of the 8 features that we looked at. So again, here is that box and whiskers plot. This is not as complicated as it looks. This is, we decompose color into red components, green components, and blue components. And again, alpine birds are in pink and sagebrush birds are in orange. So this is the light brown base color on the back feathers of these birds. And that was actually darker in our alpine birds. But then again, we look at the features that are supposed to differ, which include the dorsal streaks on those back feathers, these dark streaks. And we found no difference between our sagebrush and our alpine birds. So again, there was substantial overlap in color between sagebrush and alpine birds in Colorado. So moving on to genetics, and genetics these days is kind of the gold standard for taxonomic work. We use blood, or in a few cases feathers, to look at the same diagnostic mitochondrial DNA locus that the taxonomist John Klicka looked at back in 1999. Now, of course, that's kind of ancient history in a fast-moving field like genetics. So we took it a step further, and we also looked at the entire genome sequence. So we're talking about millions of base pairs for all of these different individuals. We did that in cooperation with Kristen Ruig's lab at Colorado State. So just the mitochondrial DNA, we found no difference. So at this one locus on a certain gene in the mitochondrial DNA that was supposed to differ between Brewers and timberlines in the published paper, we found that all of our birds actually matched with sagebrush Brewers. There was one in each sample that had a timberline, what they call a haplotype. So that type at that locus. So basically this tells us all of our birds are sagebrush Brewers, including our alpine birds. So when we looked at the genomic data, we found 4 main clusters. And I got a call from Kristen Ruig. She was all excited. She said, "We found clustering in your data set. We've never seen this before in migratory songbirds. This is so exciting." And then those clusters were completely unrelated to habitat, geography, sex, or any of the other potential confounding variables she looked at. So she's still scratching her head about why we saw this clustering pattern. It's kind of an unexplained, raises more questions, and that's going to require like range-wide sampling of Brewer sparrows to figure out what's going on there. What it means that the take-home is that there was no genetic differentiation in either the autosomes, which are the non-sex chromosomes, most of them, or in the sex chromosomes between our alpine and our sagebrush birds. So just to summarize, although our timing of breeding and our habitat match timberline sparrows perfectly, with a couple of exceptions, minor exceptions in the right direction. Most of our songs, morphology, color, and our genetics all tell us that these are sagebrush birds. So going back to our original ideas about what these birds could be, we concluded, based on the accumulated evidence, that these are really just sagebrush birds breeding in atypical alpine habitat. That was not what a lot of birders expected. We had birders that were reporting timberline sparrows in Colorado, and I was like, hold on, we don't really know yet what they are. So these are just sagebrush birds doing weird things. Not totally unexpected. Sagebrush birds sometimes breed in other shrubs. But why would our sagebrush breeders and our alpine breeders be genetically more or less indistinguishable? Especially considering that alpine birds are breeding 6 weeks later on average in a completely different habitat type. So one possibility is that these actually are different populations. They have different demographic rates. Maybe they migrate to different places, but maybe they interbreed. And so if they interbreed enough, you're not going to see any genetic signature of one or the other. Another possibility is that they are different populations, but they have not diverged genetically. Maybe that's because we have natural or sexual selection pressures that are more or less the same in alpine areas and sagebrush areas, not enough to cause them to diverge and become reproductively isolated. Or maybe it's this colonization of alpine willows that there's no genetic signature yet. Given, if we're around, I'll do this talk in another 100,000 years and we'll see what happens. Another idea, and again, Andrew Spencer, he came up with this idea, is that they're itinerant breeders, meaning they could be birds that breed down low in sagebrush first in May and June, and then they shoot up in June and July, later in June and July, to breed again. Brewer sparrows will renest successfully up to 3 times per year. And so that's entirely plausible that they could be renesting at higher elevation. It's a little bit of an outside possibility, though, because this is only known from 2 other species in North America, and the best example is Phainopepla, the silky flycatcher, the black cardinal of the desert, as they call it. They breed in the Mojave Desert in early spring, and then they migrate to the central coast of California and breed again in oak woodlands. What? But, there's different solutions to the same problem. And that's one of the solutions they've come up with. So that's still a possibility, and we don't know yet. So just to kind of summarize everything that we found, we know that Colorado has a really widely distributed population of these sagebrush brewer sparrows that are breeding in alpine willow and crumholtz. So this really expands what we thought we knew about brewer sparrows in our species assessment for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. There's a recent paper from the Great Basin that also suggests they're more of a shrub obligate rather than just a sagebrush obligate. They're certainly most abundant in sagebrush. And I think there's still a few sagebrush patches kind of down valley that you can find them in the spring. But I also know that they've been found, I was just looking at eBird records this afternoon. They've been found in a bunch of different shrub types, even here in the valley. And we know that when you look at the literature, there's about 14 different shrub species that they're known to nest in. So they're bit more of a shrub obligate. Of course, things move a little bit slowly when you're updating information about habitat and distribution, but our state and federal species assessments will have to take this new information into account. We also think there's probably alpine breeding populations in other states. And part of the reason I say this, a good friend of mine from grad school, Caleb Putnam, he wrote The Birds of Montana. He actually called me in 2020 and he says, "Hey, what do you think about those timberline sparrows from Alta ski area in Utah?" Wait, what? Boop, boop, boop. Look it up on eBird. Lo and behold, there's a ton of records from the alpine right up at Alta ski area. You could go look that up yourself. And that tells me that, places like Utah, there's also records from Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, Nevada, California. Ted Floyd, editor of Birding Magazine, he actually reported brewer sparrows in the mountains in Nevada above tree line way back in the day, like 2000, So anyway, are there undiscovered alpine breeding populations in other states? Almost certainly, we think there are. And our results also have some implications for the evolution of timberline sparrows. So I'll sidetrack here a little bit into evolutionary biology. So John Klicka, who's the taxonomist, and his co-authors, they argued that timberline sparrows should probably be considered a separate species, an incipient species, meaning that they're just recently diverged. Of course, I like to think about speciation as, as humans, we like to take gray things and put them in black and white boxes, right? We want to categorize things. But what is a species? Well, in evolutionary terms, you can have 2 populations that are starting to diverge. So they can be anywhere from out here, like flamingos and red-tailed hawks, or they can be really, really closely related. And we think that timberline sparrows are one of the most recent divergences among sister taxa in North America. And I got this question last night and I looked it up. So it's thought that they, based on mitochondrial DNA, that they probably diverged somewhere between 40 and 80,000 years ago, at the end of the one of the periods after glaciers receded. So, but we have alpine birds. Again, they argue that based on, in part based on differences in breeding habitat and timing of breeding, that they should be considered a full species. But maybe that's true up in southern Canada where they overlap in latitude. It's not true here at all. So our results kind of complicate that argument that they should be considered a full species. They also thought that, they hypothesized, they thought, okay, as glaciers receded in Canada and sagebrush expanded, actually it used to be much further north in Canada than it is now, sagebrush expanded, they hypothesized that those sagebrush brewers expanded with the sagebrush and then jumped to alpine willows that became newly available after glaciers receded and there was enough time for soil and vegetation to start forming. You know, we're talking tens of thousands of years type of thing. But our results actually suggest these timberline sparrows could have come from our Colorado alpine willow populations. They might have started here and then colonized mountain ranges further north before starting to diverge. So just another, you know, if you want to get down in the weeds on evolutionary biology and taxonomy, you know, that's something that I kind of dabble in. So it's fun to talk about. And fortunately, Kristen, you know, answering some of these like larger evolutionary questions are really going to take a range-wide genomic sampling of sagebrush birds, timberline sparrows, as well as birds in their wintering areas. And the Bird Genoscape Project at CSU, run by Kristen Ruegg, they're doing this for a number of different species where they're doing genomic sampling and they're linking individual breeding populations with the individual places where they winter. Huge conservation implications, and they've just added Brewer sparrow a couple years ago when we finished this project to their website. So hopefully there'll be some range-wide genomic sampling happening. Kind of the one question I get at the end of this is always, so is CPW going to keep working on this? We're a little bit more of a hook and bullet agency. We're responsible for all the wildlife species in the state. But now that we know where they occur and their distribution, there's a little bit less urgency in terms of our, state wildlife action plan and our conservation assessments. So we have pretty good information. I'm hoping to get back to this at some point in my career once I get all my sage-grouse research published. But that's where you all come in, and birders in general. So there are a few things that would really help the most. First, we only have 3 confirmed breeding sites. So going to some of the known sites where they occur, Independence Pass, Taylor Pass, there's a bunch of other places that you can actually just drive right up to. It would be great to confirm breeding at more sites and get exact locations, because eventually I can take all of those locations, link them to vegetation, topography, and elevation, and then map the potential breeding distribution of these birds in Colorado. And eventually actually come up with density estimates of singing males or territorial males and come up with a total abundance estimate for the state. It's kind of like a snapshot in time. How are these birds doing, right now? It would also help if we confirmed Brewer sparrows at places where we think they occur. I got kind of cocky because I was like, oh yeah, John Tulin, just go to that site. They'll be there. Lo and behold, they were. Independence Pass, they'll be there. And they were. So I have a pretty good feel of where these birds should be, but we really need people to get on the ground and just say, are they even there? So I've got 30 different priority sites. If you want to help, go visit. I can point you to the right direction. Go visit an alpine site in June or July when these birds should be there. Mid-June to maybe, mid-July is the best time to detect them. Find some willow crumholts, the stuff that I just showed you and told you about. Go birding. Look for breeding status. Are they carrying food? Are they carrying nesting material? Are they feeding fledglings? Are there little fledglings with their cute little yellow, gape around that can't fly yet? That must be a local breeder. And then submit your eBird checklist. Right when you submit your eBird checklist, I can look it up, include it in our data set. These are 30 different priority sites. I kind of rank them in terms of difficulty of getting to. From, extreme difficulty is like a 7-mile drive on a dirt road with a 15-mile hike, to the top of a mountain. And other ones are super easy where you can literally just drive right to them. Places like Boreas Pass, Hagerman Pass, Billings Lake, it's a popular recreation area. So there's places all over the state that if you want to go birding and look for these guys, you could. If you go, the other species to look for in the same kind of drier willow patches on ridges and slopes that are with Brewer sparrows include species like white-crowned sparrows, Wilson's warblers, and then our slate-colored fox sparrows. Again, if you start finding Lincoln sparrows, that means you're probably down here in the bog, the willow bog. If you're finding Lincoln sparrows, go uphill and look in the willows above you. One more species that you should really keep an eye out for, and I feel like this is a real opportunity here to learn something new. These sage thrashers, they, quote, also appear regularly in alpine tundra in the fall, late summer, really. There have been numerous records of displaying sage thrashers in alpine areas in Colorado. I think there's at least 14 records that I saw in eBird just the other day. And that's including 2 that we found during our surveys. My technician, Aaron Yappert, who did a ton of work on this project, he called me up on the phone when we were out on Gerosa Mesa in the San Juans. Brett, I've got a displaying male sage thrasher, and I could actually hear it. That bird was right here. He had found it when he was surveying this enormous willow patch on Gerosa Mesa, and I could hear that bird from the hill way up above me. So I knew exactly what he was going to tell me, but it was still pretty exciting. It's also my understanding that one of the Roaring Fork Audubon field trips actually found a fledgling sage thrasher at Independence Pass in 2023. So that bird could easily be a local breeder up there, but nobody to date has confirmed nesting of sage thrashers in alpine willows. You could be the first. So papers from this project were published in 2024, and they're available online for free. I have a couple of copies, hard copies. If you want them, I can pull them out at the end. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Just to add, one of the best parts about this project is all the amazing scenery that we got to do when we were out there serving. It blows your mind that we live in Colorado.
Thank you, Brett, for the amazing presentation. Does anyone have a question?
Brett, I have a question on
I didn't do
the
it.
sagebrush, and it does pertain to our valley,
Yeah.
so there may be someone in the back of the room that'll answer this. Is there a sagebrush species in our valley that is rather large and is endangered?
Not that I know of. My understanding is that there's mountain big sagebrush, which tends to be more higher rainfall areas, more mountain populations. And then you would have Wyoming sagebrush in the lower elevation. Maybe, I'm not sure if actually Wyoming big sagebrush occurs in the Roaring Fork Valley. I'm not sure if you have basin big sagebrush either. That's the stuff that occurs right in these drainages with greasewood. We have that in the Grand Valley. I'm just not sure. Where are my plant people? I need. So I don't know if there are any sagebrush species that are endangered. Not the ones that Brewer sparrows would breed in, which tend to be the tall and common ones: Wyoming, mountain, and basin big sagebrush. Yeah.
guys.
Other question?
This might be kind of a silly question, but do you know if individuals ever like breed in sagebrush one year and then willows the next year, or do they typically just stay in the same habitat year after year?
So males in sagebrush are highly site faithful. So I worked on these birds for my master's degree. I had a huge color banded population in this sagebrush fragment surrounded by wheat fields. So they all had to stay there. I color banded all the males, caught them on mist nuts. I followed them by their songs. And those males came back every year to the exact same, roughly to the same territory, to the same spot on my larger plot. So they do have really high site fidelity. But that does not preclude them from leaving that site and going somewhere else, higher elevation. Eastern Washington, they don't have anywhere to go. I mean, unless they fly all the way to the Cascades, 100 miles or whatever, that was not a possibility. Here we have sagebrush in places that are very, very close to the alpine areas. I'm just going to show you one of those spots. This is at Twin Lakes near Leadville. This is one of our highest elevation Brewer sparrow breeding areas. And then you get up here, a month or 6 weeks later after I took this picture, this is where you would find birds up at tree line. So it's like 20 kilometers. I mean, what is that, 13 miles or something like that? Not very far apart. So they have opportunities here to do that. So it's a possibility, but we don't know yet. It's really hard to track a bird that weighs like 2 nickels in your hand. There are some things that we could do. One of the ideas, I was actually talking about this with Chris at dinner last night, was putting geolocators on this bird. And that geolocators use changing light levels to track the approximate location of where birds go. And they've just made them small enough. Anna Chalfoun with USGS at Wyoming Co-op Unit, University of Wyoming, she was the first to put geolocators on brewer sparrows. I think that was her grad student, so I don't know if it's published yet. But we could do that. We could put a geolocator on a bird in an alpine area. So this is a bird we know is using an alpine area. See where it winters, come back, catch the bird again, take the geolocator off, download the data, and figure out where it went. And if it hung out in sagebrush for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and then moved up to an alpine area, that would be a really good indication of itinerant breeding. So maybe I'll talk to my boss about getting some funding for that. I would love to do that.
I was just curious what the banded population of these sparrows is in Colorado. Have there been any banding projects through your research or anything like that?
We use little silver aluminum bird banding lab tags for these guys. We only banded the birds in the areas that we were working and where we sampled them. We have had no recoveries of any of those banded birds. I'm not aware of anyone banding brewer sparrows as part of like a breeding study right now in Colorado, but I'm also not, I'm not the point person for all of that information for the state. So there could be, somebody at a university or a grad student that's working on brewer sparrows. I know Anna Chalfoun had a bunch of grad students, and she's, been doing a ton of work up in Wyoming on Brewer. So she has a lot of banded birds up there, or she has at least in the past like 5-10 years. I don't know how many are currently banded.
Gotcha.
So we could call the bird banding lab. Just email them and ask them, how many birds did we band last year? Yeah.
Hey, Owen, how time did you catch you? He just said,
Yes. No worries. Yeah. How exactly do you capture the birds to observe them?
Yeah. One of the things that I really liked about working in sagebrush is the birds can't fly over you. There's no trees for them to escape to. So we use things called mist nets, which are really, really thin nylon mesh. They have tiers in them, usually 4 tiers. They're about, they can be anywhere from 6 meters long to 12 meters long or larger. And you put them up in an opening in sagebrush within a bird's territory. and we have Bluetooth speakers. We'll put one on each side of the net. You play one of those speakers, that male comes in, he's super aggressive. He's like, that guy's in my territory, I'm gonna run him out of here. He comes in, if he misses the net or doesn't fly into it, and he goes, let's say he goes over the net because he saw it, and then you switch to the other speaker, and he thinks that bird went that way, and he chases after it, boom, into the net. It falls into what's known as a bag in the net. It's like a little bit, the mesh is a little bit loose. So I know there's people in here who've done bird banding before. And then you very, very carefully extract them. They're tiny, tiny little birds and very fragile. So you grab them by the legs first, get their feet undone, and then you essentially work the mesh off the bird, pop it out. And that's some of the pictures you saw of, birds in the hand. You can hold them like that in either the leg grip or what's called the bander grip, where you put their little neck in between your two fingers and you hold their body. That's when you're banding them and, doing wing measurements, things like that. More detail than you wanted.
Oh, that's exactly what I did want, actually. And they're fairly resilient. And,
yeah.
And then I guess the follow up to that would be, like, you were talking about your study where you did band them. Like, does capturing them ever push them to different parts of their territory, or are they pretty short memory span?
So yeah, they're super short memory span.
Yeah.
They do have tiny brains. So I color banded a whole bunch of birds for my master's degree. I let them all go and they stayed on territory and they all nested. I kept track of all their nesting attempts. I kept track of which female was paired with which male. So they are really resilient. That said, Parks and Wildlife, as part of our training, is that bird welfare is top priority. So if you have a bird that you think is in danger, you need to let it go as soon as possible. So we got our processing down to something like 8 minutes. So we kept track of all of our processing times, and we, boom, band your bird, take your measurement, feather sample, open the wing, blood sample, boom, boom, off he goes. My technician, Aaron Yappert, he went out like a week after I had banded some of these alpine birds, and he caught them again. So they were right there in the same place. He didn't know where I had actually worked. So he was like, oh, wait, this is a banded bird. Yay. So they're pretty resilient. But you do have animal welfare is really, really important when you're capturing wild animals. It's a huge issue that we have to be really cognizant of. I was actually just the animal care and use chair for Colorado Parks and Wildlife for the past 2.5 years. And requires lots of training and reporting and all that type of stuff. It also requires that you need a bird banding a license from the bird banding lab. So you need to have evidence that you're trained in all these techniques.
Thank you.
Can you tell I like to talk? Any other questions? I'll be around. Thank you. I read that up. Thanks, McKenna. I'm going to grab this fruit.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you to Brett. As a reminder, we have our next Naturalist Night in 2 weeks, March 3rd and March 4th, here at Howland Lake and also in Carbondale.